Welcome, everybody, to Soccer 101. My name is Taylor Rockwell, and this week I'm very excited because we get to answer the age-old question, who are those guys sitting on the bench occasionally whispering things at the manager with great intensity? It's assistant manager time, Graham Ruthven. Are you ready?
I am ready. I'm ready to talk about the puppet masters in soccer. Taylor, it's all a conspiracy. The people with the real power are the assistant managers, justice for the Kloppelganger, is what I'm saying.
At what point do you think that becomes a requirement, that you have to look somewhat like the manager? And why is that the case? Is it a subconscious thing of, like, if I look like him, he'll keep giving me opportunities and responsibilities?
Seems like a growing trend in soccer because there was the Erik ten Hag, Mitchell van der Gaag looks quite similar to... So maybe that's part of Pep Lijnders. So Pep Lijnders, who was Jurgen Klopp's... as part of the reason why we're doing this episode this week, Pep Lijnders is going to Man City. He was Jurgen Klopp's assistant for a long time at Liverpool. Maybe that's part of like his hazing at Man City is he walks into the manager's office and there's just Pep standing there with a razor.
Yeah, exactly.
Get your head over the sink, pal.
Yeah. Hat off, veneers out, head over the sink. It's shave time. All right, so similarity to actual manager aside, Graham, let's talk about what an assistant manager actually is. And I think the very simple answer is they are a lot of different things based on the manager that they work for.
Yeah, it's pretty self-explanatory. It's in the title there. They are the Dwight Schrute of the soccer world, the assistant to the regional manager. They are the right-hand man to the manager, and that can entail a lot of different roles. So some assistant managers are expected to do different things to other assistant managers, but the essence of the role is that they are in position to help the manager, right? And I think the best assistant managers have that quality where they are more than just a coach, right? They have the complete confidence of the manager who ultimately has the final say, but maybe they are a close confidant of the manager. Maybe they're sharing ideas. So there's a sense that they are more than just like a first team coach. You hear about first team coaches and assistant managers, and those roles are like interchangeable. It kind of depends on how the club sees those roles. But I think of a first team coach as someone who is maybe their role is purely on the training ground. Their role is more practical. They might take the warm ups, whereas an assistant manager might have an input into tactics and maybe even transfer strategy.
Yeah, I mean, and it can be liaising with like marketing side of things. It could be branding and sponsorship. You could have an assistant manager who's like liaising with the people who are in charge of that, so you don't have to do it as the manager. You could have a assistant coach who's focused on the medical side of things, so that they are sort of liaising with the medical staff and the training staff and making sure that everybody's like on the same page and up to speed. And so you can have those specialized roles. That's what I think is so fascinating about the position, because ultimately it goes back to that manager and how much control that manager wants, how many different things they want to oversee or be able to kind of delegate to people that they trust, which is where I'm assuming Pep Lijnders comes into this equation, because it's clearly work he has done for Jurgen Klopp that has Pep thinking that might be a guy I need. And then it's always interesting to see how quickly they do actually gel or clash, because Pep is not short in his demands.
Yeah, I think he must have read, Pep Lijnders wrote a book called, I think the title of it was Intensity, and so maybe that was Guardiola's his summer reading, and so he's decided to get another Pep, of course, in double Pep at Man City for the start next season.
He shaved that head, he grows some stubble, he rants on the sidelines, he's already getting it all done. So, Graham, when you think of like a definitive assistant manager, what is the role? What is the responsibility?
Yeah, so I think, as I said, the role of an assistant manager, it can be quite a broad one. So they have a background in, obviously, football training and coaching. They will need coaching badges in the same way that a manager needs them. So in a lot of ways, the qualifications they need are the same. And you also get a lot of assistant managers who maybe have a background in psychology and group management. And this is from the coach's voice. I mentioned the coach's voice on this show quite a bit. It's a very good resource for anything to do with soccer coaching, but this is a passage. An essential responsibility of the assistant manager is to obtain as much information as possible from the players and provide the key takeaways to the head coach. This work will allow the manager to spend less time on decision making and more time focusing on how to get the most from their team. The assistant must therefore have a good, close working relationship with the players, and that comes back to what you were talking about, Taylor, of like a liaison is a large part of the role, and that can be a liaison between the other coaches. I think the assistant manager is quite often like the head coach, and I know that's confusing because obviously the manager's the head coach, but you know what I mean, like he's almost like the head of the coaching contingent. It's then up to him to maybe organise the coach, relay some messages from the coaches to the manager, and they're also a liaison between the players and the manager. So if you are a player who is maybe unsure with your role, I think it's quite common for, rather than approaching the manager, it'd be quite common for you to have a discussion with the assistant first, who can then maybe relay some of those concerns. So I think while a coaching background is almost always necessary, I can't really think of an assistant that wouldn't be used in that way. I think people skills are also just as important.
Yeah, absolutely. Because like Sir Alex Ferguson is the one I always go back to, where like by the time he is near the end of managing Manchester United, he is the kind of person on top of the pyramid, not quite a pyramid scheme, but is on top of that pyramid and has so many different people reporting to him that he can then oversee the kind of big picture stuff. He's not overseeing daily training, but he is there. He is observing it. He is seeing how players respond. He's kind of observing so that he can inform how he wants to prepare for a game. But he has a first-team coach or an assistant coach that he trusts to do the drills and set up the drills, and they'll communicate on what needs to be worked on, what they need to prepare for, how they want to prepare for a specific opponent. Then he leaves it to his assistants to make sure that that training is being done. He can then move away from the actual sort of running of the training to watch how the players are responding and if they are responding to what's being asked of them so that they are prepared. Because it's really hard in the moment, in training, in a game, to kind of remove the emotion, remove that sort of like on the ground viewing and see the bigger picture of what all is happening. And I think having different people who can report to you means that you can keep that objective viewpoint. And I think that extends to the medical side of things, for example. I think there are certain managers who drive their assistant coaches to really push the medical staff to make sure that they aren't giving players slack, that they aren't being overly cautious. And I think that's all part of the manager's overarching vision. That seems to be a really big thing with Pep Guardiola, is he wants somebody who's going to be talking to the training staff, to the medical staff, and just, you know, like, maybe 2 or 3 weeks, but maybe 1 week is how far he's out. And that way, it's not Pep who's having to go break away from training or break away from tactical preparation to go deal with medical staff. He has a trusted lieutenant who he can send out to make sure that they are relaying his instructions and getting the job done.
And that word you just used there, trusted, trust, is key to all this, because you're going to have to rely on the insights of your assistant manager. There needs to be that relationship, and that's why you see a lot of managers having long-time assistants who they take around various jobs. So Jose Mourinho, Rui Faria was his long-time assistant for a long time. Pochettino, it's Jesus Perez, right, is the assistant that's been with him at, I think, all of his clubs, Tottenham, Chelsea, PSG, now with the US as well. And that's because these the trust between these two figures is well established by that point. And I think without that trust, it doesn't really work, the whole dynamic.
I mean, really, like the maybe the best example for people who have the casual familiarity with soccer to the very good familiarity with soccer is Coach Beard from Ted Lasso, right? Like that, he's the one who's reading and inverting the pyramid and running the training sessions and coordinating with Coach Shelley to come up with like the specific plays and the specific tactics. It is not the head coach Ted Lasso who is doing all that work. It's him who's kind of approving things and being like, all right, if you think that's the best way, and then he's managing or motivating or talking to the owners and doing lots of other things. I think that's a really good example of how you can have that trusted relationship that allows you to know how to operate really effectively, but it also just gives you reliable support staff. If you're a new manager taking a really big gig, you're going in there and you have a lot of respect and admiration theoretically, but you also have a lot of pressure and you don't have a ton of advocates. Having a whole staff of people who you can kind of bond with, be with, gives you a little bit of comfort. It also gives you a little bit of security because you have people around you that know how you want to operate and can reflect that in training and in daily operations.
Yeah, and that bleeds into the routine during the match day, where you will see a lot of the time assistant managers are the ones out on the touchline giving instructions to players, or obviously like managers will be out on the touchline as well, but you will see assistants maybe pulling players over for like one-to-one chats, or maybe a small group if there's a break in the game, or like before a penalty shootout or something like that. Other assistant managers, don't really leave their seat in the dugout and will offer more private thoughts to the manager when they sit down next to them. So there's all kinds of different dynamics here. When you mentioned Coach Beard, Taylor, with him being the one who's reading inverted the pyramid and he's the one who's maybe got the tactical thoughts, that's quite an old-fashioned idea, I think. And in modern soccer, you see a lot of the head coaches or managers wanting to have like full control over the tactical side of things. They maybe will lead training as well. So
Xabi Alonso driving in balls is a good example. like some coaches are going to sit in the stands and watch and observe, and then some coaches are going to be like, this is how you hit a driven through ball. I'm going to do it 30 times in a row so you all can learn.
Yeah, so there are different kinds of dynamic, but I still can't get over that video from Xabi Alonso. It's one of the most incredible things
good.
he's basically the midfielder that Real Madrid needs at the moment, so maybe that's why they've hired him. But there's all kinds of dynamics between assistants and head coaches.
And then there's all kinds of personalities and profiles as well with assistants, and you can kind of boil them down in a couple ways, starting with, like, if you're a new manager coming in, you might have a club legend or a managerial holdover. And so sometimes that's the goalkeeper coach who's going to stick around, who's been there for a long time or was a former goalkeeper. Or sometimes it's going to be a striker who's going to stick around to do specific training. But they're going to have some connection to the club so that you have that consistency, you have that connection to the history and the way they've operated. Manchester United have done that routinely with new managers coming in. You have Darren Fletcher sticking around, or Ruud van Nistelrooy was brought in, Steve McLaren was brought in once again.
Ryan Giggs was, I think, passed between. He worked under Moyes, I think, first, and then Van Gaal latterly. Steve Clark maybe fits into this category. He played over 400 games for Chelsea before becoming Mourinho's assistant. He had no previous relationship with. That was actually quite a successful one, and of course Clark's gone on to have his own semi-successful career as Scotland manager and at other clubs. But yeah, there's this idea that a club legend will help integrate. It's normally a foreign manager into the ways of the club, and I don't really know if that's a real thing, but that's the train of thought.
And I think you then can have like a lifer, is I guess how I would put it, as like Rui Faria is a good example of that, though he then went and did his own thing for a season. And I'm not sure if he's managing anymore, but there are those personnel who are basically like, nope, I am the trusted lieutenant. Where my captain goes, I go with them. And so that would be, what's Poch's guy again?
Jesus Perez.
Yeah, like that's a good example of that. Where he goes, I go, and I'm going to roll with. And I think some assistant managers are going to have that aspiration to then do it on their own, but I think there's other ones who enjoy not being, heavy lies the crown, that sort of role, but I think enjoy working with somebody and being theoretically well paid to be an assistant, be an advisor, do very specific aspects of training, and maybe not violate the Peter principle of getting promoted to a point where they're no longer effective. And I do enjoy the ones who've kind of just been in the same gig with the same person for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, whatever it may be. Graham, are there other different kinds of assistant managers in your mind?
I think there are some assistants who are used to round out some aspects of the managers, like a weakness. So the best example I can think of here is Carlos Queiroz, who was brought in because Ferguson's Man United was frequently criticised for lacking structure and defensive organisation. So Queiroz was brought in to help with this. And Manchester United started to do a lot better in Europe. That was the big manifestation. The big argument was Man United at that time were not defensively sound enough to consistently compete in Europe. And to be honest, after that, Manchester United did a lot better, a lot more consistently in the Champions League. So there might have been something to that. And credit to Ferguson, he recognised something in his own coaching that an assistant could help with. And Queiroz, by all accounts, had a lot of influence at Manchester United. If you ever listen to Roy Keane talk about Carlos Queiroz, they did not get on. I don't think.
Did Roy Keane get on with anybody? Did he ever praise anybody on a consistent basis?
He got on well with his dog, I think.
Trigged?
Yeah, that's a bit. Beckham as well. I think he fell out with Carlos Queiroz at some point,
and he escaped him to go to Real Madrid, where his next manager.
Yeah, he became the manager.
Yes,
within a few weeks. Yeah. I love that story. I think.
I was going to say, Steve McLaren is another example of that with Manchester United, where he's brought in and then basically invents and then modernizes their data and analytics department and their scouting department as well. and does such a good job in kind of his organizational structure and in creating good workflow that I think that's leveraged into more senior gigs where, again, I think the Peter principle so often applies to assistant managers. Maybe Steve McLaren wasn't ready to take that England job.
Yeah, and Pep might be doing it right now with Linders. Mm-hmm. Linders' whole thing apparently is like pressing. Well, the title of his book is Intensity, right? So he has potentially brought him in to fix some of the issues we saw from Man City last season. And Pep actually has had a good number of high-profile assistants over the years. Of course, Tito Villanova was his long-time assistant at Barcelona before he tragically passed away, of course. But you have Juanma Lillo is another one. I think he's staying at Man City. I don't think Linders is coming in to replace him. I think he's just being added to the coaching team. But Lillo is regarded as one of the best thinkers about football anywhere in the world, and Pep really takes his opinion on things. You also have an example here, a Scottish example. When Steven Gerrard was Rangers manager, he actually had like 2 categories of assistant manager. So he had the experienced head who was there to guide a young manager, and also like a Scottish legend. So that was Gary McAllister, who was his assistant. And then he had another assistant who was Michael Beale, who he'd worked with at Liverpool and took with him to Aston Villa. And Beale, while he was an absolute disaster as Rangers manager in his own right, he's a really interesting character where he's got a lot of thoughts about tactics. He's worked in Brazil. He's worked all around world soccer to collect these ideas. I don't think he had a professional career as a player. And so Gerrard leaned on Michael Beale for a lot of his ideas. So that setup was quite interesting because you had Gerrard, who was very much of the school of manager of taking a broad overview of things. I think it was Michael Beale that took the training. But then he also had like the experienced legend in Gary McAllister to help guide him.
And then, of course, Graham, we have the plucky upstart, the youngster, destined for bigger and better things, or theoretically destined, and then maybe we see how it goes, where it's basically the usually former player who's getting into management. They take the assistant gig to get their reps and to kind of like learn more on the job, and then the idea is that they are then going to jump ship to become their own man, their own manager, and see how it goes. I would say a pretty prime example of that would be Mikel Arteta, starting his managerial career as an assistant for Pep at Man City, then obviously getting the Arsenal gig not too long after that. But it's an interesting story. The abbreviated version is they are at Barcelona at the same time as players. I think Arteta was in the academy, and Pep was already in the senior team, but had some level of a relationship there that continues to grow and stay in touch over time. And then it's in 2012, I think, maybe 2011, Pep reaches out to Arteta when Pep is still managing Barcelona. He has questions for Arteta about Chelsea and how they play, because Barcelona are about to play Chelsea in the Champions League. Arteta at Arsenal, obviously having plenty of familiarity with Chelsea. And from what I read, Pep is basically so impressed by the level of detail and precision of Arteta's reporting and how they play and where their vulnerabilities are and ways to exploit it and ways to create overloads that he's sort of like, this is a guy that I want to work for me. When Arteta retires as a player, he has 3 different options, and they are all very good options, including under Arsene Wenger at Arsenal, I believe also Pochettino at Spurs, and then Pep at Man City, and he goes to Man City, and here we are now where he gets his reps, he learns more, he develops more as a manager, and then when the opportunity comes, he takes over the senior gig at Arsenal. And there are plenty of those types of examples where a young ex-player, sometimes not ex-player, has a point to prove and just works their way up and finds a way to then leverage a position into a better position, and eventually they get the big gig.
Yeah, Pep found someone that was close to him on the weirdness scale in Mikel Arteta, and now Arteta is trying to destroy him, like Anakin, and I actually lose track of what that story is. Anakin and who's the other one? Darth Vader and Luke might have been a better example there. But yeah, Arteta is the best modern example of this. A couple other examples, incidentally, 2 people who are not former players, at least as far as I'm aware. Patches O'Houlihan himself, someone who had a good coaching background, ended up as Berhalter assistant, I think was quite deeply embedded with US soccer, but was clearly keen to become a head coach in his own right. kind of leverages the what was the tournament he was in charge? The Nations League, right? Last year he was in charge of the US national team while that whole process was happening, and he eventually becomes the national manager last year and is actually doing pretty well in charge of that club right now. Paul Clement is another good example. So he was Carlo Ancelotti's assistant at Real Madrid, Chelsea, PSG, Bayern Munich. Earned a bit of a reputation for himself. I guess it helped that he kept on being pictured lifting really big and important trophies next to one of the best managers of all time. He then becomes a manager in his own right. I think his first job was Swansea, had a slight degree of success at Swansea, and then I think it kind of fizzled out after that. And apparently he is back to being Ancelotti's assistant now for Brazil. So he's come full circle, but he was, for a long time, he was the quintessential, like, successful, high-profile assistant who then moved into management.
Was Mourinho an assistant for a while there? Was he like translator? Is that where he starts and then works his way up?
You are asking a question that I asked of myself yesterday when I was researching for this, because it's not listed on his Wikipedia page. He was certainly the translator for Bobby Robson.
Yeah.
And I think then ended up taking coaching sessions as like a result of that. But there are other articles that said he was an assistant manager, but I don't know if that was maybe like an unofficial thing for him.
Maybe the better example of, well, I guess he was a player but never had senior appearances, is Julian Nagelsmann, who is like poised to break through and become a professional, but has his second knee injury before the age of like 18, I think, or maybe 20. Decides, that's it, I'm done trying to be a player, I'm not going to go through this again. Shifts into management, starts off with Hoffenheim as like the U12s coach, I want to say, and then works his way up to becoming the U19s coach, while then also functioning as an assistant, and then does so well with his youth coaching and youth development combined with his role as an assistant that then he is ultimately given the head coaching gig at Hoffenheim when he is 28 years old, I think. That was the youngest coach in the Bundesliga at the time. Not sure if we've had a younger one since then. So you can have those types of managers who are younger with a point to prove, come through, cement their legacy, and on they go.
Have you heard me talking about Ian Cathro? So he was this, unfortunately, he became this sort of subject of a culture war in Scottish football where people just pointed at him and shouted nerds because he had done things slightly differently. But anyway, he had an incredible CV as an assistant in his 20s. He was assistant at Newcastle, Valencia, Wolves. He worked under Rafa Benitez. He worked under Nuno. And so he becomes Hearts manager. This is quite a while ago now. Unfortunately, didn't last very long at Hearts, but he is now the manager of Estoril in Liga Portugal, and they're doing quite well. So, come on, Ian Cathro, I'm rooting for you. We need someone to disrupt the status quo of proper football men in Scottish football, and I'm rooting for you.
Graham, can you think of examples? I hope Scottish football continues to be disrupted in a positive way. Can you think of any examples, because there are ones where you have the assistant take over after like the senior manager departs as a way of sort of keeping stability, of just kind of like keeping things going, keeping the status quo in place?
So the most famous example is Bob Paisley, right? He was assistant to
Jock Stein?
Shankly. No, to Shankly, yeah. He wasn't on my list, so I'm kind of going on my general knowledge here, but I'm pretty sure Paisley is the best example of that. Joe Fagan as well, is that another Liverpool? Liverpool did it a couple times, quite successfully. I think a less sort of like famous example might be Sammy Lee. Do you remember him? So he was Big Sam Allardyce's long-time assistant. He kind of looked like a wee like terrier dog or something. He was like a wee short guy with like light blonde hair, and so he was the assistant at Bolton. Big Sam Allardyce, I think, went to Newcastle that summer, and so they gave it to Sammy Lee, and he was really bad. So that was less successful.
It seems like a thing that doesn't really work all that often when they do that, because like the idea is, oh yeah, you're the heir apparent, you're kind of steeped in the tradition, you'll be able to do the same thing. But oftentimes I think that manager has to do a lot more than we might know, and maybe the assistant is not quite ready for prime time, so to speak. Yes, Graham.
Tito, right? That's another example. Tito Villanova, he replaced Pep after he left Barcelona. Actually was there for 4 seasons, Tito, and was successful. And of course, a big factor in why he ended up leaving that job was a non-footballing matter, of course. So yeah, he's a more recent example.
Was Pep the reserve team coach before he takes, or when he takes over from Rijkaard?
He was the B team manager. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So
not quite the same then.
Not quite, but close.
But close. Graham, any other notes on assistant managers, types of managers, or types of assistant managers? Anything else?
No, just that in a lot of ways, their tick box of qualifications is very similar to a manager, which is why you end up with a lot of assistants moving into senior management. Zinedine Zidane was Ancelotti's assistant until he took over and won like 10 Champions League titles in 9 seasons.
Pretty good example.
Jogi Löw was Jurgen Klinsmann's assistant, and then proved that he was the brains behind the operation
that's a great one.
By winning the World Cup as Germany manager. So, the roles are one and the same in many ways, but just split in. It's about how you cut the cake, right? And that's why I think it's quite an interesting role, because you get loads of different kinds of assistant managers that are expected to do different things in different ways.
Yeah, and I think that there's a book in there somewhere, because I think it would be fascinating to just hear how different managers approach it. Like we talked about Xabi Alonso with like being actually involved in training and doing things in training versus Carlo Ancelotti. You assume could have hit those passes, but probably wasn't doing so with his suit and cigar. But like the managers who are speaking to their assistants as like, I don't know, trusted confidants who are peers versus you are a trusted lieutenant who needs to go out and perform your role. And I think there's probably some coaches who have conversations versus some who bark orders at their assistants. And I think both can be valid and both can be successful, as can the many other different approaches. It just requires the right combination of personnel in the right environment. You don't want a barking orders manager working with people who are used to being discussed, like having discussions and being involved in the decision making. I think that's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, and sometimes the barking orders managers, in terms of how they deal with their players or the media or whatever, they can surprise you and not have that relationship with their assistant. So Fergie's maybe a great example of that, because I don't think his relationship with Steve McLaren was ever barking orders with him. Maybe the best example.
Just looked at him and he was like, "Yes, sir."
Yeah, that might have been it. But perhaps the best example of this is Peter Taylor will appear at the top of a lot of lists of the greatest assistant manager. So he was Brian Clough's long-time assistant. They won 2 European Cups together at Nottingham Forest. And anyone who has watched The Damned United will know Taylor didn't go with Clough to Leeds, and the suggestion was that Clough wasn't the same manager without Taylor by his side. And look, this might be a dramatisation from that film, but within that film you've got like Clough sneaking away to call Peter Taylor for his opinion on things, even though I think did he take over from Clough at Derby County or something? I think he was in another role, but Clough is still like
somewhere else entirely. But yeah.
But he's like seeking Taylor's advice. So Brian Clough, one of the spikiest managers in English football history, still had this relationship with his assistant where there was a warmth between the two of them.
And I think if nothing else, you definitely had moments at Leeds where Clough is up against this completely different culture, this completely different environment. And he doesn't have his trusted associate who he can kind of commiserate with and be there to come up with plans and how to deal with it. And I think you see how that goes for him in the end. So I think the final takeaway is that assistant managers kind of important when it comes to having a successful team and a successful club and a successful tenure as manager. Graham Ruthven, I will happily be your assistant manager any day of the week.
Oh, thanks. I mean, I don't drink much coffee, but I do drink a lot of tea, so you might have to get used to working a kettle, which I believe, having stayed in many American hotels that are lacking kettles, you might need a tutorial on that, because I'm not sure there's many kettles in the US.
I've got a kettle, and I know exactly how you like your tea. It goes sugar, cream, tea bag in, then the hot water, right?
Sure, yes, those are definitely the ingredients. I definitely have cream and sugar in my tea.
And then milk on top as well.
Yeah, and a crumbled cookie, like a biscuit, in there as well.
Just trying to think how angry I could make Ryan Bailey with, like, I'm going to do that next time and then insist that that's how tea is supposed to be made. And just
Ryan had, when we were in New York together, Ryan had a very particular tea brewing process, which was more. I drink a lot of tea. I do. I drink maybe like 4 or 5 cups a day. I don't have that process. Ryan had a whole thing.
No, he didn't have a process, but he had it to the level that, like, even if you did it right, it was still going to be like, bit of heavy pour. Didn't need that much. Ooh, not enough water. You need more water. Like, it was very specific what he wanted it to be.
It was.
I'll still be an assistant manager for him as well. Graham Ruffin, thank you again. Listeners, thank you all again. We greatly appreciate it, and we'll talk to you next week.